All right, good afternoon, good people. I hope that everyone is well. All right, so I want to sort of work through chapter four for you today. We're going to try to probably get through about the first 25 or 30 slides, and then I'm going to have a doc that I want you to watch, a documentary that is going to also underscore and amplify much of what I'm going to talk about today. All right. So, chapter four is where we are this week: Rising Expectations, African Americans in the Struggle for Independence, 1763 to 1783. All right. So, first off, here you see an image. African Americans actually fought on both sides of the U.S. War for Independence. This is a 19th century painting of a black patriot who aims his pistol at a British officer during the Battle of Cowpens, fought in South Carolina in 1781. Now, our learning objectives this week are the following. In 4.1, we want to analyze the factors that involve in the crisis of British Empire. And then 4.2, we want to describe what the Declaration of Independence meant for African Americans. Again, this critical document meant different things for different people. And of course, for those enslaved and those fighting for and desiring freedom, the Declaration of Independence meant something different. All right. 4.3, we want to discuss the African Americans who contributed to the Enlightenment. I'll talk a little bit about what that means, and we'll get into that, particularly when we think about the great poet Phillis Wheatley. Okay, now, Phillis Wheatley is one of those names you should know and try to keep in your memory bank somewhere. All right. Okay, from 4.4, we want to evaluate the African American role in the War for Independence, and then 4.5, we want to explain how the American Revolution weakened slavery. Okay, this is a critical piece that we want to never forget, is how slavery was weakened during this fight for independence. All right. Okay. So let's analyze the factors involved in this crisis of the British Empire. Now, again, remember when we watched the 1619 Project piece, one of the things that the scholar mentioned in the documentaries was that the British were essentially late to the game when it came to empire and when it came to expansion into the so-called New World, into the Western Hemisphere, into the Americas, into the Caribbean. Okay, again, the Dutch, all right, the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish, they all preceded and were oftentimes concurrent with British incursion. So the British were late. So in fact, it would have not made sense for Britain to create an empire given the scramble for empire that was widespread throughout Europe. Okay. All right. So Great Britain and France, this was a major crisis and struggle for empire. The basis for American independence movement and the rising black hopes for freedom rested on this struggle between Great Britain and France. In 1689, British and French started a series of wars in Europe, India, North America, Africa, and the Caribbean. The climax came with the French and Indian War, which started in North America in 1754 and spread to Europe in 1756, called the Seven Years' War. This, of course, extended to other parts of the world. But the most important thing is to just keep in mind that empire is a struggle. It's a fight. All right. It's what we call a contested terrain. All right. A contested terrain. This is where various empires are fighting one another and trying to acquire as much land and resources as possible. All right. So here is an interesting image. You'll find this in your text, European claims in North America. You see the one here in 1750 on the left and the other in 1763 on the right. The various colors, you can see the kind of light blue French claims. And then later up in the green section, you see under French control. Then you see the British, et cetera, et cetera. So just take a look. This is also in your textbook. Okay. These maps illustrate the dramatic change in the political geography of North America that resulted from the British victory in the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763. It eliminated France as a North American power. France surrendered Canada and the Ohio area to Britain. Spain ceded Florida to Britain and, as compensation, received Louisiana from France. Of course, I've talked and I mentioned, and I'll talk more about sort of how the Louisiana Purchase came about, and that was primarily because of the defeat of the French in the Haitian Revolution, and of course Napoleon scrambling for empire and scrambling to try to pick up the pieces after Haiti defeats the French and declare independence in 1804, and consequently Napoleon decides to sell France's holdings or control of land in what we know of is the Louisiana area or Louisiana Purchase, all right, which actually almost doubled the size of the U.S. Okay, British and French competed for control of the Ohio River Valley and its fur trade. From 1754 and 1755, French and their Indian allies defeated Britain in this region and went on to attack western frontiers of the British colonies. From 1758 to 1763, British military forces pushed France to withdraw from North America. All right. So the major consequences of the war were indigenous people east of the Mississippi had difficulty resisting white encroachment. Again, the longest war in this period, of course, is the war against indigenous people, Native Americans. Fugitive slaves, those enslaved in the Florida area, could not flee to Florida swamps, and they lost a lot of Spanish protection. One of the things the Spanish did was said, hey, if you flee to our territory, you can seek and have freedom. All right. So this was an incentive. And this, again, was part of that battle of empire between the Spanish and the British. All right. And but many would escape to Florida and, again, form maroon communities with indigenous communities. I've talked to you all about that in terms of Seminole. All right. The Seminole Indians. All right. Semi meaning half. And we talked about that before. And of course, I mentioned Little Yachty's new record, Black Seminole. Okay. Americans no longer needed protection from the French and the Spanish, and bonds between Britain and the colonies weakened. Okay. So this is some of the consequences. And this is part of this crisis. All right. So pay attention to crisis. Think about conflict, challenges that the British Empire faced along the way. And then, of course, what that meant for what would become the United States. Okay. 1760s, Parliament passes laws that Americans thought were oppressive. All right. There was a proclamation of line of 1763, which forbid American settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Sugar Act of 1763 levied import duties to raise revenue for Britain, and the Stamp Act in 1765 taxed printed materials. I'm going to provide you with a video to talk about this question with the great historian Gerald Horne, who has a very interesting take. He looks at the American War for Independence, as a counter-revolution. And he makes a really profound argument that speaks volumes to the centrality of slavery and African Americans, to the transition and the fight against British colonialism among what will become U.S. or Americans or U.S. citizens. Okay. And so we're going to take a different look at this question through the lens of Professor Gerald Horne in the documentary that I'm going to show you. All right. So you have these various acts: the Sugar Act of 1764, which levied import duties to raise revenue for Britain, and then the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed printed materials. All right. So from October 1765, the Stamp Act Congress met in New York City. A move toward uniting the resistance, agreement not to import British goods. Okay, so this is a fight and a push against British control. Now, what Gerald Horne is going to argue is that essentially the crisis in the empire, and the most important place in the empire at this time, was not necessarily the United States, but actually it was places like Jamaica, where they were producing sugar in high volume, and the sugar revolution was huge in the triangular trade at this particular time. But he also believes that and argues that that slavery, the British saw that slavery was not sustainable. And they also found that it was really difficult to continue to provide resources for British colonists to continue fighting Native Americans. So they really wanted to halt the westward expansion of British colonists over the course of these early years, right? And so it was halting Western expansion, which George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and others who were all land speculators, they all wanted to continue to expand and push forward. In fact, after the Thomas Jefferson is able to acquire the Louisiana Purchase, he initially says he wants to have an empire of liberty. But this empire of liberty, given the cotton boom, becomes an empire of slavery. And it also becomes a moment where we see massive expansion to the West. And this has, of course, super negative consequences for indigenous people. All right. Okay, let's continue on. I'm going to skip this section here on the continued crisis. You'll get more of this in your text. All right, I'm going to skip through and jump through a few things here. All right. So let's talk about the Declaration of Independence and African Americans. Describe what the Declaration of Independence meant to African Americans. All right. So on July 4th, 1766, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. So all of you have heard about this. You've read about it in textbooks. You've even probably seen images of it over the course of your life. So let's talk a little bit about it. Thomas Jefferson was its principal author. Jefferson, of course, was a Virginia slaveholder who regarded African Americans as inferior. You're going to learn a little bit about that also in the video you're going to watch on Liberty in the Air. All right. The intent behind his language was not to provide support for Black claims for freedom. John Adams helped draft the Declaration. He was also a slaveholder. They distinguished between rights of white men and the rights of people of color. The first draft of the Declaration denounced the Atlantic slave trade. Congress deleted this passage, and the final version referred to slavery only in accusing the British of fomenting slave revolts. All right, so they didn't want to touch it, but they didn't want to destabilize it either. All right, so let's get a little further into it. Now, for African Americans, they believed the war for independence would be a war against slavery. All right, this was really important, and the British, of course, were actually pushing this idea. All right, the Patriots made unqualified claims for human equality and natural rights. African Americans forced white people to confront the contradiction, new ideals versus reality. So if you are pushing for a fight against colonialism and new ideas, etc., and African Americans see that there's a real contradiction in your ideals and your reality, they begin to raise questions about this and so forth. All right. Let me pause this. So the question becomes for white Americans' choice to either accept the literal meaning of the Declaration or reject the revolutionary ideology supporting claims for independence. All right. All right. Here is a image, and of course, the first person to die in the U.S. War for Independence, or what some call the American Revolution, was none other than Crispus Attucks. A Black man, and this is a portrait showing him on the ground, and he again is important because he was the first person to die in the Boston Massacre. All right. All right. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to take a little time and Google Crispus Attucks. All right. He's an important figure that oftentimes appears during Black History Month. And of course, we are in February during Black History Month. So I want you to Google Attucks and tell me what you learn about him, particularly when I get back, okay? He is still really one of the critical symbols of African-American patriotism because he was a fugitive slave who escaped his master in Massachusetts. He was the first person killed in the Boston Massacre and the first American casualty in the Revolutionary War or the American War for Independence. You'll learn why I'm saying American War for Independence as opposed to the Revolutionary War. All right. Now, the Enlightenment. Let's talk a little bit about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment and its impact on African Americans. The European Enlightenment influenced the Patriots' ideology in the Age of Revolution. In 1687, Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica used mathematics to portray an orderly universe run by natural laws discovered through reason. So this is a period where we see a move from a kind of religious inclination to more of a scientific analysis of how the world works. People like John Locke applied Isaac Newton's ideas to politics. They maintained that human society ran according to natural laws, and at the base were natural rights shared by all people. Humans created governments to protect life and liberty and private property. Okay, this is another critical piece. Private property is a big part of this moment in the Enlightenment. If government failed or became oppressive, people should overthrow it. So this was a revolutionary idea because so much of what we saw before that was, of course, monarchies, kings and queens ruling over nations. And of course, this was still the case at the time, but these new ideas began to come forth during the Age of Revolution within the European context. All right. And they saw no contradiction between these laws, though, and enslavement. And again, Africans, all right, and people of color and the colonized have a different place in this period of enlightenment. In fact, they have a place of inferiority and a place of being at the bottom of the human pyramid. All right. And this, again, is foundational to Enlightenment thinking. All right. And it structures not only the Declaration of Independence, but it structures law and custom moving forward. And this, of course, is really important to keep in mind. The impact of the Enlightenment, Locke's ideas spread through pamphlets and was distributed by a radical minority in Britain. White patriot leaders were clearly influenced by Locke's ideas. He charged that the British were trying to enslave Americans and drive them of their rights as Englishmen, but did not see any contradiction with the treatment of African Americans. So this is the big part of the early schism and contradiction, of course, where here you have British colonists arguing and fighting fervently for their own freedom, for their own self-determination. But at the same time, of course, African Americans are enslaved. All right. And they saw no contradiction because they also saw African Americans as inferior and non-human, even though their humanity was always needed, though it was questioned, but it was always needed. Again, this is also part of the absurdity of slavery. Okay. This is a drawing that depicts James Armstead, who, as an enslaved young man, served as a patriot spying during the War for Independence under the command of Marquis de Lafayette, whose name Armstead later added to his own. He infiltrated British camps in Virginia. He provided information that helped George Washington force the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781. All right. So let's continue more. African Americans in the revolutionary debate. African Americans were optimistic that patriot leaders would see the contradiction between slavery and revolutionary principles. Like, they really thought, hey man, you guys are gonna see that our condition is not in line with what you're fighting for. You need to know that. And they were very active. They really engaged, all right? They weren't just sitting back passively. They had their eyes and their ears open, and they were aware of these debates and these conversations and discussions, all right? Some English and white Americans pointed out the contradiction, which helped improve the situation for Black people in the North and Upper South. African Americans also acted on their own behalf. They exercised their own agency. And from January 1766, you saw a march of enslaved Africans through Charleston representing this agency. Many enslaved people escaped from the Low Country during the Revolutionary era. All right. Freedom suites Enslaved Africans went to court to win liberty on contractual technicalities. Again, engaging the law, recognizing what's going on, not being passive, actively working to secure their freedom. Black men adopted revolutionary rhetoric to petition state legislatures for emancipation. Black men also demonstrated against the Stamp Act and served with white Minutemen. Okay. Again, they had a real loyalty, and the British would later come out and actually say, hey, you join our ranks, we're going to abolish slavery. All right. And this, of course, is why African Americans actually really did join the British in huge numbers, outnumbering those who would fight on the side of the Continental Army by a large margin. Okay. All right. So let's go move forward. Let's talk a little bit about the Enlightenment, the Black Enlightenment. Enlightenment shaped careers of America's first Black intellectuals, the era when amateurs would make serious contributions to human knowledge. They were rich and well-educated, like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. With limited resources, African Americans became scientists and authors. African American intellectuals influenced by the Great Awakening, people like Jupiter Hammond, a Long Island enslaved African who published religious poetry. People like Joseph Bishop and Lemuel Haynes were Black ministers to white congregations. So again, a very, very small few people, but important and significant nonetheless. All right. Now, again, in terms of the Enlightenment, one of the more important people that we want to recognize is none other than Phillis Wheatley and her poetry. Wheatley was born on the African continent. She was brought to Boston on a slaver at the age of 7 or 8, and Wheatley was purchased as a servant for his wife. She learned English and Latin. She became a fervent Christian. And age 13, began writing poems to celebrate events. In 1763, the first book of poems was published. The first book was published by an African-American woman. The second was published by an American woman. She was later freed by the Wheatleys, and in 1778 married John Peters. Wheatley called on Black people to adopt white culture. She became a fervent patriot. She advocated John Locke's ideas about environment influencing humans. Thomas Jefferson dismissed her work, and others considered Wheatley an example of what people of African descent could achieve if freed. Now, again, Wheatley represents a line of thinking among African Americans. All right, there were some who really thought that to support the patriots, right, to really be deeply invested in developing a kind of an Americanness and American consciousness, that this would later win the favor. All right. And so there was a strand of that thought running through the African American community, just like there was a radical strand that said, hey, we got to break away from this. This is not going to lead to our liberation. All right. So this was, again, something that we see, and it's important to know these figures and to see that there's these sort of contradictions and sort of complex ideas that African Americans, of course, are not all thinking the same way. They have different interpretations, different kinds of investments, different kinds of experiences. And so this leads to a variety of political, ideological, and philosophical strands of thinking, all right, in the community, right, which again speaks to the complexity of it. All right, and this will run throughout African American history. Okay, here's an image of Wheatley and one of her book of poems. All right, you can see this in your text. All right, all right, let's move on. Let's go to Benjamin Banneker in science. Banneker High School, really famous high school in Washington, D.C. I have a lot of friends who've gone to Banneker. But Benjamin Banneker was born free in Maryland in 1731, and he died in 1806. He was the son of a mixed-race mother and an African father. He inherited a farm from his white grandmother, which gave him a steady income. He attended a racially integrated school, and he learned Latin and Greek. He was interested in mechanics, gained international fame as a mathematician and astronomer, and became the first Black civilian employee of the U.S. government as a surveyor. Again, these are very important because look at what African Americans are able to achieve under tremendous duress at this particular time. All right, it's not easy. All right, and so the Bannekers of the world, the Phillis Wheatleys, they're not they definitely stand out. They are not representative of the masses, but they are important nonetheless because they demonstrate Black people's aspirations and desires, and the fact that they were able to find the strength and the wherewithal to achieve what they were able to achieve is actually a miracle. All right, when we think about it. All right, I am going to stop it here and pick up the next piece for next class. But from here, you're going to go ahead and watch Liberty in the Air. All right. See you all next time.